football is just not as good as that team. There's Brazil 1970, there's Cruyff's Ajax, there's the Barcelona team that Cruyff built, and there's Arsenal in the early Wenger years. For me, that's entertainment peak for football.
Welcome to the latest episode of Season 2 of Football Uncovered. In Season 1, we took you inside Blackburn, Leeds, Portsmouth, Liverpool, FIFA and a lot more. Heard about extraordinary stories of football chaos, cock-ups and outright corruption. This season, we're going inside 8 more Premier League clubs, as well as having 2 special episodes. One about life after the Premier League and one about the very future of club football at the highest level. I'm your host, Will Brazier, and with me every episode is Sporting Intel's Nick Harris. Nick, how are you?
Good, thanks. Looking forward to this. Lots and lots to talk about.
This season, it's not just me and Nick. We're also joined by a guest each week, usually a fan of the club we're talking about or someone who has followed them very closely and knows all the inside stories. As well as sharing all the usual inside stories from each club, we'll of course be looking at the owners of the club, how they came to be there, where they've taken the club so far, but most importantly, what is next. And we're delighted to say today's guest is Phil Wall. Phil, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Lovely stuff. Now, you're a long-suffering, it says long-suffering Arsenal fan here, but as a Birmingham City fan, can't be that hard about the Carling Cup 2011, but it's not all bad, is it?
No, I mean, there have been plenty of good times. As you say, lifelong Arsenal fan, which I inherited from my father. So the first football match I ever saw on TV was the 1971 FA Cup final, where we actually had to go next door to our neighbours because we didn't have a TV until later that year. So I was about 5 then. So I then supported Arsenal from a distance at that stage through the 70s. Then we did occasionally go and visit Highbury. I first went in 1972. But there were a lot of wilderness years for Arsenal in the 70s. Then we had a cup win in 79. And then we had a few more wilderness years until George Graham turned up. And then lots of good years. And then Arsene turned up, and it was taken to sort of stratospheric levels for a while. So yeah, there've been a few low periods, but as an Arsenal fan, you can't really complain over the last 30 odd years. I don't think we've had a pretty good run. So I was a season ticket holder for a while in the 90s, but that's gone by the way now with family and marriage and kids and everything else. So the price of a ticket going up from about £4 to 40 had an effect on me as well. So yeah, but I'm as you say, long-standing fan. I'm also involved in the Arsenal Supporters Trust, where I've been on the board for about 12 years, and I've contributed to the Guna fanzine for about 20 years from the late 90s. So yeah, lots of involvement.
Love that. Phil, for you as an Arsenal fan over the last 25 years, what sort of been the biggest turning points, both good and bad?
Chelsea and Man City, and David Dean going and Arsene going a bit stale. All those things you could argue were all kind of turning points in their way, but nothing as seismic as Arsene turning up in the first place, which was the real big event of the last 25 years. I think everything else has just kind of flowed from that.
Arsene Wenger changed English football, and not just Arsenal, as much as Pep Guardiola has done, and probably more, and I'll explain why. I mean, Wenger came in, he was an economist by academic background. He was absolutely into his sports science. There was a joke at the time that particularly from Ian Wright about having to eat broccoli, but he transformed sort of the dietary habits of the team as much as he did sort of the tactical habits. He had a drinking culture at the club that he needed to deal with, which he did. He obviously, being French, knew the French market and started recruiting players from all over the world in a way that hadn't been so much the case up to that point. And then obviously once he started producing the teams that he did on the pitch in different eras between sort of the first double season of 97-98 up to the invincible season of 2003-04, he sort of just transformed the club, and everyone else in the division, everyone else in football decided or saw what he was doing and started to copy him. So a lot of these things that he introduced to Arsenal that became seismic changes in the game, sort of a challenge to this monolithic culture of English football at the time, to be a much more a philosophical exercise as well as a sporting exercise, as well as conditioning exercise. He changed the game massively and was very, very, very successful at it for those first sort of 6 years. And absolutely, that was a period when basically without him at Arsenal at that time, probably quite possibly you would have had Manchester United being the dominant force in English football for the first 12 or 13 years. The list of players that Wenger brought in was, obviously Thierry Henry, probably. I don't know, Phil. What do you reckon for best buys under Wenger? I mean, Thierry Henry's got to be up there, hasn't he?
Henry and Vieira are the ones that stand out, and Vieira was really the linchpin of that team from the moment that Arsene turned out, because Vieira was obviously signed a few weeks before Arsene's contract actually started, and he was a phenomenal player. I mean, as a midfielder, you could only put even Roy Keane in the same bracket as him, and I would say that Vieira, obviously, I would say Vieira was a better player than Roy Keane, but there was nobody else in English football at that time, I don't think, who compared to the effectiveness of Vieira as a midfielder. And then obviously Anelka, as Will mentioned, was very effective for a couple of seasons and was replaced by Henry, who was even more effective. And there were many others. It was just a great team. Obviously Bergkamp was there already. Pires, Overmars. This stunning football that team produced for 4 or 5 years I don't think has been seen in England before, and hasn't been seen since. The football is just not as good as that team. There's Brazil 1970, there's Cruyff's Ajax, there's the Barcelona team that Cruyff built, and there's Arsenal in the early Wenger years. For me, that's just entertainment peak for football.
By the end of it, it was quite fascinating, because as an outsider, I just didn't really understand his stubbornness, and like you can literally see with Ferguson bringing in those different assistants and obviously he wasn't on the coaching field, that with his new assistants they'd bring new impetus, and the game changed so much as well, doesn't it? Because by the end of his tenure, like, player power is such a massive thing, whereas at the start of his career he could sort of almost rule the roost and not be a big dictator, but lead the way, and the players would follow. But by the end of it, that wasn't the case. And then with the stadium, it just always seemed to be, especially from an outsider perspective, that this stadium was like the pot of gold at the end of the road. And then once that was paid for, and they'd get there, and it would sort of be back to challenging Manchester United and that sort of 1-2 dominance. But it just never really came. And then plus with the transfers, it seems from like 2006, I think it just feels like they've either missed out or had the chance to sign every best player in Europe, but never pulled the trigger on it. And I know some of those names get added to the list probably out of spite, but yeah, just haven't got it right.
But they also became a selling club as well. I mean, they actually were selling their best players to rival clubs during that period.
Which is probably epitomised with the Van Persie transfer, isn't it? I always find it interesting hearing him speak about how he was trying to put suggestions to Wenger and to the board about how he felt the club should be run, and ultimately led with him going to Old Trafford and winning the title.
So if we go to Wenger goes, and the model changes as Emery comes as head coach, the club's first head coach in 2018, under a structure that was still relatively new, including Sven Mislintat as head of recruitment and Gazidis was CEO, although they both went. Fast forward to Arteta coming in as manager in late 2019, so a year and a bit ago, won the FA Cup, finished 8th in the Premier League. And then the head of football, Raul, left last summer, and Arteta was manager again, not head coach, working with the CEO, Vinay, and the technical director, Edu. I mean, what sense do we make of the sort of just the tactical, the strategic switching so many times in the last 2-3 years? What's that about?
Yeah, it's very difficult to perceive much of a long-term strategy here with so many ins and outs. Gazidis obviously was a stable point in the boardroom for sort of 10 years or more. I don't claim that Gazidis was superb in his role as chief executive, but he was certainly a force of stability and of understanding modern football, whereas you could argue that the other Arsenal board members, you know, so Chips Keswick, Peter Hillwood, when he was still on the board until a few years ago, Lord Harris, they're not people who are understanding football in the same way that certainly an Arsene Wenger understands football, or an Alex Ferguson understands football, or understands what clubs need to do. They're just people who had sat in the boardroom for a long time. And when you have to reorganise, and as you know, as Will said, things changed, and player power has really come into it, and agents, the role of agents and everything else. Now, when Peter Hillwood became Arsenal chairman in I think it was the 1970s, when his father died and he inherited the title of Arsenal chairman, he didn't have to deal with agents. He didn't have to, you know, make multi-million-pound deals. He put a contract in front of a player for, you know, £100 a week or whatever it was, and they signed it, and that was it. So it's a totally different world, and I think Arsenal are struggling to get a structure that's adapted to the modern world, because the board structure was so outdated, and with a lack of diversity. The average age of Arsenal board members until recently, you had Ken Fryer, who's now in his 80s, has only just left the board. You had Peter Hillwood, Chips Keswick, Lord Harris. Stan Kroenke himself is 73, so he's no spring chicken either. And the average age of the board was over 70, which is, you know, it's not a forward-looking organisation if that's going to be the case.